Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the marble terrace, watching her father-in-law's corporate empire celebrate his 40-year career. The evening air was crisp against her skin as she observed the carefully orchestrated retirement gala unfolding before her. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the gathering of executives, board members, and industry titans who had come to honor Richard Blackstone's legacy at Meridian Industries. She had learned to read rooms like this during her previous life, cataloging exits, identifying power structures, noting who carried themselves with the practiced confidence of those accustomed to violence. Old habits died hard, even after 3 years of trying to blend into the corporate wife role that marriage to Marcus had thrust upon her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The conversation behind her grew louder as the evening progressed and expensive wine loosened tongues. Sarah's fingers unconsciously traced the thin scar along her collarbone, hidden beneath the silk of her navy dress. She had chosen the outfit carefully, conservative enough to avoid drawing attention, elegant enough to fit among the crowd of pharmaceutical executives and their polished spouses. Everything about her appearance tonight was calculated to project normalcy, the kind of unremarkable presence that allowed her to fade into backgrounds when necessary. Marcus appeared at her side, his face flushed with champagne and the glow of reflected success. His father's achievements had always cast a long shadow over their marriage, and tonight he basked in the inherited prestige that came with the Blackstone name. He slipped his arm around her waist with practiced familiarity, though she noticed the gesture felt more performative than affectionate. They had been growing apart for months, two people sharing a house but living separate lives, connected more by routine than genuine intimacy. Richard Blackstone commanded the center of the terrace, regaling a circle of admirers with stories from his decades building Meridian into one of the country's largest pharmaceutical manufacturers. His silver hair gleamed under the lights as he gestured expansively, every inch the successful executive who had climbed from regional sales manager to chief executive through sheer determination and strategic brilliance. Sarah watched him hold court, noting how he effortlessly controlled the conversational flow, redirecting questions he didn't want to answer and emphasizing achievements that burnished his legend. The evening took its first dark turn when Rebecca Martinez, one of Meridian's board members, approached their small group with an expression Sarah immediately recognized as predatory. Rebecca had never warmed to Sarah's presence in the Blackstone family circle, viewing her as an outsider who had somehow infiltrated their exclusive world. Her smile carried the sharp edge of someone about to draw blood in a socially acceptable way. Rebecca's voice carried clearly across the terrace as she addressed the growing circle of listeners. She had positioned herself strategically, ensuring maximum audience for whatever performance she was about to deliver. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that preceded danger, though she couldn't yet identify the specific threat approaching through the evening's polite conversation. The attack came disguised as concern, the way corporate assassinations often did. Rebecca launched into a carefully constructed narrative about Sarah's behavior over the past year, painting a picture of instability and erratic actions that sounded reasonable to ears unfamiliar with the speaker's agenda. She mentioned Sarah's tendency to disappear for days without explanation, her reluctance to discuss her background before marriage, and what Rebecca characterized as paranoid behavior during company social events. Sarah stood frozen as Rebecca's words washed over the assembled group, each carefully chosen phrase designed to plant seeds of doubt about her mental state and fitness as a corporate wife. The conversation around them gradually quieted as more people turned to listen, drawn by the uncomfortable electricity that crackled through Rebecca's seemingly concerned observations. Marcus shifted beside her, and Sarah felt his arm slip away from her waist as he unconsciously distanced himself from the growing spectacle. The crowd pressed closer as Rebecca warmed to her theme, describing incidents that sounded increasingly alarming when stripped of context and delivered with the right mixture of reluctance and civic duty. She spoke of Sarah's insistence on sitting with her back to walls in restaurants, her habit of memorizing license plates in parking lots, and her apparent inability to maintain normal friendships with other executives' wives. Each detail was factually accurate but reframed to support a narrative of mental instability rather than the hypervigilance of someone trained to notice threats. Richard Blackstone listened with the expression of a man discovering an uncomfortable truth about his family, his earlier jovial mood evaporating, as Rebecca painted an increasingly disturbing portrait of his daughter-in-law's psychological state. Sarah watched him absorb the information with the same analytical approach he brought to business problems, weighing evidence and calculating risks to his carefully constructed reputation. The moment that shattered Sarah's composure came when Rebecca produced her phone, scrolling to a photograph she claimed to have taken the previous week. The image showed Sarah in workout clothes, but Rebecca described it as evidence of Sarah practicing what appeared to be combat movements in her backyard, behavior she characterized as deeply concerning given the domestic setting, and Sarah's obvious focus on techniques that seemed designed to incapacitate rather than exercise. Marcus finally spoke, his voice tight with embarrassment and confusion. He asked Sarah directly why she had never mentioned her interest in martial arts, why she felt the need to practice what appeared to be military-style training exercises in secret. His questions carried the weight of accumulated doubts, small inconsistencies in her behavior that had apparently been building in his mind over months of marriage. Sarah's throat felt constricted as she struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal the truth she had worked so hard to bury. She couldn't explain that muscle memory from years of federal tactical training never fully faded, that maintaining combat readiness was as natural to her as breathing. The life she had lived before Marcus, before the corporate world, before the careful construction of Sarah Chen, the pharmaceutical executive's wife, was supposed to remain buried beneath layers of manufactured normalcy. The crowd's murmur grew louder as her silence stretched beyond the bounds of normal conversational pause. Rebecca pressed her advantage, suggesting that perhaps Sarah needed professional help, that the stress of adjusting to their social circle had triggered some kind of breakdown. She spoke with the authority of someone who had clearly researched the topic, using clinical terminology that made her concerns sound both compassionate and medically informed. Richard Blackstone's expression hardened as he processed the implications of having a potentially unstable person married into his family during his moment of professional triumph. The pharmaceutical industry was built on trust and reputation, and any suggestion of instability within executive families could ripple through stock prices and board confidence. Sarah watched him perform the same cost-benefit analysis that had driven his business success, weighing family loyalty against corporate liability. The attack reached its crescendo when Rebecca suggested that Sarah's behavior patterns matched those of someone suffering from severe post-traumatic stress, possibly related to some undisclosed trauma in her background that she had hidden from the family. The implication hung in the evening air like smoke, suggesting that Sarah had deliberately deceived the Blackstones about her psychological fitness when she married Marcus. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in, the same trapped feeling she had experienced during the worst moments of her previous career, when operations went sideways and extraction became impossible. But this time there was no backup team, no emergency protocols, no way to call for extraction from a situation that threatened to expose everything she had sacrificed to build. The corporate world offered no equivalent to tactical support when civilian battles turned deadly. The moments stretched endlessly, as Sarah realized that her carefully constructed new life was crumbling in real time, destroyed by someone who had recognized the signs of her former profession and weaponized them against her social standing. She had traded her badge and weapon for a wedding ring and corporate social calendar, but the predators in this environment were every bit as dangerous as those she had faced in federal law enforcement, just better dressed and more socially acceptable in their methods of destruction. Sarah retreated to the bathroom inside the Blackstone estate, her hands gripping the marble countertop as she stared at her reflection in the ornate mirror. The woman looking back at her wore the careful mask of a corporate wife, but underneath, Agent Sarah Chen of the Federal Bureau of Investigation was calculating her next move. She had spent 3 years burying that identity, 3 years pretending that her marriage to Marcus represented a genuine escape from a career that had nearly destroyed her. Now Rebecca Martinez had managed to weaponize her protective instincts against her, twisting survival skills into evidence of mental illness. The bathroom door opened and Marcus entered without knocking, his face a mixture of confusion and accusation that she recognized from interrogation rooms. He positioned himself between her and the exit, a blocking technique that would have been subtle to civilian eyes, but screamed tactical awareness to someone with her training. His voice carried the controlled anger of a man discovering that his life contained more complications than he had bargained for. Marcus demanded explanations for behavior he claimed to have been cataloging for months. He wanted to know why she never spoke about her family, why she refused to vacation in certain countries, why she always paid in cash and avoided having photographs taken at social events. Each question revealed how carefully he had been watching her, documenting inconsistencies in her cover story with the persistence of someone who had been coached in what to look for. Sarah realized that Rebecca's attack had not been spontaneous but carefully orchestrated, the culmination of months of surveillance and preparation. Someone had been feeding Rebecca information about behavioral patterns that only a trained observer would recognize as significant. The pharmaceutical executive's wife act had apparently fooled Marcus, but not everyone in the Blackstone orbit, and now she needed to determine who else knew enough about federal law enforcement protocols to identify her tells. She deflected Marcus's questions with the skill of someone trained in counter-interrogation, giving him enough emotional truth to satisfy his immediate concerns, while revealing nothing about her operational background. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She spoke about growing up in foster care, about learning self-reliance early, about developing habits that helped her feel safe in an uncertain world. The story was partially true, carefully constructed from real experiences that had shaped her long before she joined the Bureau. Marcus seemed partially mollified by her explanations, though she could see doubt lingering in his expression like a stain that wouldn't wash clean. He wanted to believe her because accepting the alternative meant acknowledging that his wife was a stranger, that their entire relationship had been built on carefully constructed lies. She watched him choose comfort over truth, a decision that would protect them both for now but couldn't last indefinitely. Returning to the terrace required every ounce of her undercover training, as Sarah faced the crowd of executives who had witnessed her public humiliation. Conversations stopped when she appeared, replaced by the awkward silence of people unsure how to interact with someone who had been publicly diagnosed with mental instability. She moved through the gathering with practiced normalcy, accepting condolences and reassurances, with the grace expected of a Blackstone family member. But her trained eyes were cataloging details that would have escaped civilian notice. She identified 3 individuals who seemed particularly interested in her reactions, their attention too focused to be casual curiosity. One was Rebecca Martinez herself, who watched Sarah with the satisfaction of someone whose plan was proceeding exactly as designed. The others were less obvious but equally suspicious, their positioning and behavior suggesting professional surveillance rather than social awkwardness. Richard Blackstone appeared at her side with the measured concern of a corporate leader managing a potential crisis. His questions seemed supportive on the surface, but carried undertones of assessment, as if he were evaluating her stability in real time. He spoke about understanding the pressures of adjusting to their social circle, about having resources available if she needed professional support, about the importance of family unity during his transition to retirement. Sarah recognized the conversation as a negotiation disguised as concern. Richard was offering her a way to retreat gracefully from the evening's events in exchange for her cooperation in maintaining family appearances. The subtext was clear: accept help for her supposed mental health issues and avoid creating further embarrassment for the Blackstone name. It was a reasonable offer from his perspective, one that protected everyone's reputation while addressing what appeared to be a legitimate crisis. But accepting his offer would mean submitting to psychological evaluation by doctors who might be sophisticated enough to recognize signs of her federal training. It would mean providing medical history she had spent years fabricating, opening herself to scrutiny that could unravel everything she had built. Most dangerously, it would give Rebecca Martinez and her unknown allies control over the narrative surrounding Sarah's background and behavior. The retirement party continued around them with the determined normalcy of corporate events that must proceed regardless of personal drama. Servers circulated with champagne and canapes, while executives discussed industry trends and political developments, with the casual authority of people accustomed to influencing both. Sarah participated in conversations with autopilot professionalism, her conscious mind focused on identifying threats and opportunities in her rapidly deteriorating situation. Her breakthrough came during a conversation with Thomas Walsh, Meridian's chief financial officer, who mentioned Rebecca's recent interest in security protocols for executive family members. According to Thomas, Rebecca had been asking detailed questions about background checks conducted on spouses and children of senior leadership, supposedly for an internal audit she was conducting. The timing suggested that Rebecca's attack had been preceded by systematic research into Sarah's documented history. Sarah excused herself from the conversation and moved toward the estate's library, where she could think without the constant pressure of social performance. The room was empty, except for the accumulated knowledge of generations of Blackstone business success, leather-bound volumes that testified to the family's legitimate achievements in pharmaceutical manufacturing. She used the privacy to access her phone and begin the kind of investigation she had avoided for 3 years. Her fingers moved across the touchscreen with muscle memory that felt both foreign and familiar after years of deliberate disuse. She accessed databases that most civilians didn't know existed, using credentials that should have been deactivated when she left federal service but apparently remained active in the system. The information she discovered about Rebecca Martinez painted a picture far more complex than that of a simple pharmaceutical executive with personal animosity. Rebecca's financial records showed payments from consulting firms that specialized in corporate intelligence, organizations that provided background investigations, and security assessments for major corporations. Her travel patterns over the past year included cities where federal law enforcement conferences had been held, suggesting she had been gathering information about current and former agents. Most disturbing, her recent communications included encrypted messages sent to addresses associated with organized crime groups that Sarah had helped prosecute during her bureau career. The pattern that emerged suggested Rebecca was not acting alone, but rather serving as a front for interests that wanted Sarah exposed and neutralized. Someone with significant resources had identified her new identity and was using Rebecca as a weapon to destroy her cover without directly revealing their own involvement. The pharmaceutical industry provided perfect camouflage for this kind of operation, offering access to corporate resources and social networks that could be weaponized against federal agents who thought they had successfully disappeared. Sarah's investigation revealed that Meridian Industries itself might be compromised, with Rebecca's position providing access to sensitive information about federal contracts and regulatory relationships. The company's recent expansion into international markets had brought it into contact with the same criminal organizations Sarah had spent years investigating, creating opportunities for the kind of corruption that federal agencies worked to prevent. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from a number she didn't recognize, containing only coordinates and a time 24 hours in the future. The communication method was one used by federal agents for emergency meetings, suggesting that someone else in the Blackstone social circle knew about her background and wanted to make contact. Whether that person represented help or additional danger remained unclear, but the message indicated that her cover was even more thoroughly compromised than Rebecca's attack had suggested. She deleted the message and returned her phone to her purse, mind racing through possibilities and contingencies with the tactical thinking that had kept her alive during the worst assignments of her federal career. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the investigation expanded beyond tonight's social assassination attempt. But for now, she needed to survive the remainder of Richard Blackstone's retirement party without revealing any more of her true capabilities than absolutely necessary. The library door opened and Marcus appeared, his expression showing the strain of managing family crisis during what should have been a celebration. He approached her with the careful movements of someone unsure of his reception, uncertainty replacing the anger she had seen earlier. His voice carried genuine concern when he asked if she needed to leave, if the evening had become too overwhelming for her to handle. Sarah realized that Marcus genuinely believed she was suffering from some form of mental breakdown, that his worry was authentic even if misguided. His willingness to protect her from further social pressure revealed the man she had fallen in love with 3 years earlier, before the complications of family expectations and corporate pressures had created distance between them. She felt a sharp pang of loss for the simple life they might have had if her past had truly stayed buried. She agreed to leave early, using the excuse of emotional exhaustion to extract them from the party before additional damage could be done. As they made their excuses to Richard and prepared to depart, Sarah noticed that Rebecca Martinez was nowhere to be seen on the terrace. The woman who had orchestrated her public humiliation had apparently concluded that her work for the evening was complete, leaving others to deal with the aftermath of her carefully planned assault. The coordinates from the encrypted message led Sarah to a parking garage downtown, 20 levels of concrete that provided perfect cover for clandestine meetings. She arrived 30 minutes early, using the time to establish surveillance patterns and identify potential threats in the surrounding area. Her federal training reasserted itself naturally as she moved through the environment, muscles remembering skills that civilian life had temporarily suppressed. The contact who emerged from the shadows was not someone she expected. David Park wore the unremarkable clothing of a mid-level corporate employee, but his movement patterns screamed federal law enforcement to anyone trained to recognize such things. He approached with the careful neutrality of someone unsure whether he was meeting an ally or a target, his hands visible, but positioned for quick access to concealed weapons. David identified himself as FBI Internal Affairs, currently investigating corruption within Meridian Industries that connected to several ongoing federal cases. His presence confirmed Sarah's worst fears about her situation, while simultaneously offering the first hope she had felt since Rebecca's attack at the retirement party. Someone within the Bureau knew about her compromised position and was prepared to offer operational support. According to David, Meridian Industries had been under federal surveillance for 18 months following intelligence, suggesting the company was being used to launder money for organized crime groups. Rebecca Martinez was not merely a corporate executive with personal animosity, but rather a sophisticated asset working for interests that had significant motivation to neutralize federal agents who possessed damaging information about their operations. Sarah's cover had been blown not through her own operational mistakes, but through systematic analysis of pharmaceutical industry personnel by criminal organizations seeking to identify embedded federal agents. Her marriage to Marcus Blackstone had initially provided perfect camouflage, but the same family connections that protected her socially had also made her a target for groups seeking to compromise Meridian's corporate structure. David explained that Rebecca's attack represented the opening move in a larger operation designed to eliminate federal assets while discrediting their intelligence value. If Sarah could be successfully labeled as mentally unstable, any future testimony she might provide about criminal activities would be undermined by questions about her psychological competence. The strategy was elegant in its sophistication, destroying agents through reputation assassination rather than physical violence. The Bureau had been monitoring the situation but could not intervene directly without exposing their ongoing investigation into Meridian's financial operations. Sarah's extraction would have to appear voluntary, the natural consequence of someone whose cover had been compromised seeking to disappear before additional damage occurred. David could provide limited operational support, but ultimately she would need to navigate her exit strategy without official federal backing. Sarah felt the familiar weight of operational isolation that had characterized the worst assignments of her federal career. She was once again operating without backup in hostile territory, forced to rely on training and instincts that civilian life had tried to soften. But this time the stakes included not just her own survival, but the protection of an investigation that could expose criminal networks reaching into the highest levels of corporate and political power. David handed her a secure communication device disguised as a standard smartphone, explaining that she could use it to contact federal resources if the situation escalated beyond her ability to manage independently. He also provided intelligence about Rebecca's current activities, including a scheduled meeting the following day with contacts who appeared to be coordinating additional moves against federal agents embedded in corporate environments. The parking garage meeting concluded with David's warning that Sarah's window for controlled extraction was closing rapidly. Rebecca's success in publicly questioning her mental stability would encourage additional attacks designed to force her into making mistakes that could be used to justify more aggressive action. She had perhaps 48 hours to either neutralize the threat against her or disappear completely from the life she had built over 3 years. Returning home required all of Sarah's undercover discipline as she faced Marcus across their kitchen table, his expression showing the strain of trying to understand his wife's increasingly mysterious behavior. He had spent the day fielding calls from family members and business associates, offering support for what everyone assumed was a mental health crisis. His questions carried the edge of someone whose patience was approaching its limits. Sarah realized that protecting Marcus required revealing enough truth to satisfy his immediate concerns, while avoiding information that could make him a target for the same forces that had compromised her position. She spoke about her background in federal law enforcement, framing her departure from that career as the result of burnout rather than ongoing operational concerns. Her explanation was carefully constructed to sound like the confession of someone seeking help, rather than the briefing of a federal agent preparing for tactical action. Marcus absorbed her revelation with the shock of someone discovering that his spouse was essentially a stranger. His questions revealed how little he had actually known about her background, how successfully she had maintained the fiction of Sarah Chen, the corporate wife. But rather than anger, his primary emotions seemed to be concern for her well-being and confusion about why she had felt unable to trust him with the truth. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching their house, engines that carried the distinctive rumble of professional-grade transportation rather than neighborhood traffic. Sarah moved to the window with fluid precision, her body automatically assuming a defensive posture as she assessed the potential threat developing outside. 3 black sedans had positioned themselves around the property with tactical efficiency that suggested federal or private military involvement. Marcus moved to join her at the window, but Sarah gestured for him to remain back, her training taking control as the situation escalated beyond civilian protocols. She recognized the deployment pattern as one designed for extraction rather than assault, but without communication from David Park, she could not determine whether the arriving force represented rescue or additional threat to her position. The doorbell rang with aggressive persistence, followed by authoritative knocking that demanded immediate response. Sarah approached the door with the measured caution of someone who had survived similar situations through careful assessment rather than hasty action. The voice that called through the door belonged to someone accustomed to immediate compliance, though she could not identify the specific agency or organization from vocal patterns alone. Opening the door revealed a team of 6 individuals wearing the conservative business attire that marked federal agents operating in civilian environments. Their leader displayed credentials identifying him as Special Agent Rodriguez from FBI Internal Affairs, though Sarah's training made her automatically suspicious of anyone claiming federal authority during unscheduled contact. She demanded verification through channels that would confirm Rodriguez's legitimacy before allowing the team to enter her home. Rodriguez provided the verification she requested, while explaining that the situation had escalated beyond David Park's initial assessment. Rebecca Martinez had accelerated her timeline following intelligence, suggesting that federal agents were becoming aware of the organized crime group's infiltration of pharmaceutical industry operations. The team's presence represented an emergency extraction designed to protect Sarah before additional attacks could be launched against her position. But Sarah's instincts warned her that something was wrong with Rodriguez's explanation. Federal extractions followed protocols that included specific communication sequences and verification procedures, none of which had been properly implemented during this contact. She stalled for time while using the secure device David had provided to request confirmation of Rodriguez's authority and mission parameters. The response came within minutes, confirming her suspicions about Rodriguez's team. They were not federal agents but rather private contractors working for the same organized crime interests that had been targeting federal assets embedded in corporate environments. Their extraction offer was actually a kidnapping attempt designed to neutralize her before she could provide intelligence about criminal activities she had observed during her marriage to Marcus. Sarah activated the emergency protocols built into her secure communication device, while simultaneously preparing to defend their position against a team that now represented immediate physical threat rather than potential rescue. Her civilian life was officially over, replaced by the tactical reality of federal agents under attack from sophisticated criminal organizations with resources that rivaled those of law enforcement agencies. The sound of additional vehicles approaching the house indicated that the situation was expanding beyond the initial contact team. Sarah's federal training automatically cataloged available resources, escape routes, and defensive positions, while her mind calculated the probability of successful resistance against what appeared to be a coordinated assault on her position. Marcus stood frozen in their living room, finally understanding that his wife's mysterious background involved dangers that could destroy everything they had built together. The moment that changed everything came when a new voice called through the door, identifying himself as James Morrison, Chief Security Officer for Meridian Industries. Sarah recognized the name from corporate meetings she had attended with Marcus, though she had never personally interacted with Morrison during her time as a Blackstone family member. His presence suggested that Richard Blackstone's company was more deeply involved in the evening's events than she had initially understood. Morrison requested permission to enter alone, claiming that he possessed information that would clarify the situation and provide context for the federal agent's presence at their home. Sarah granted his request after Rodriguez's team withdrew to defensive positions around the property, their movement patterns confirming her assessment that they were private contractors rather than legitimate federal personnel. James Morrison entered their house with the bearing of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations that required both tactical awareness and diplomatic skill. His first words were directed not to Sarah, but to the painting hanging above their fireplace, a reproduction of a military scene that Marcus had chosen for its artistic value rather than any deeper significance. Morrison studied the painting for several seconds before turning to face Sarah directly. His next action changed everything. James Morrison came to rigid attention and delivered a precise military salute that could only have been intended for someone who had earned the highest levels of respect within federal law enforcement community. His words carried the weight of recognition that transcended corporate hierarchies and social expectations. Agent Sarah Chen, Morrison said formally, Medal of Valor recipient, Presidential Citation for Excellence in Federal Service, former Director of Special Operations for Counterintelligence Division. It is an honor to finally meet you properly. Your undercover work dismantled 3 major organized crime networks and saved countless federal agents from compromise. The Bureau asked me to watch over you during your transition to civilian life, though I never expected to meet you under these circumstances. The salute hung in the air between them, transforming the evening's events from personal crisis to federal operation, with implications that reached far beyond Sarah's individual situation. Marcus stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, finally understanding that the woman he had married possessed a background that existed at the intersection of national security and organized crime investigation. Morrison explained that Meridian Industries had been cooperating with federal authorities for months, serving as a honeypot operation designed to attract criminal organizations seeking to infiltrate pharmaceutical industry operations. Richard Blackstone's retirement party had been carefully orchestrated to force Rebecca Martinez and her criminal associates into revealing themselves through attacks on federal assets they believed were vulnerable. Sarah's cover had been deliberately compromised as part of a larger operation designed to expose the network that had been targeting federal agents embedded in corporate environments. Her apparent isolation and vulnerability had been necessary to convince criminal organizations to commit resources to eliminating what they perceived as a significant threat to their operations. The sound of additional sirens approaching their neighborhood indicated that Morrison's revelation was the signal for federal authorities to move against the criminal network that had gathered around Sarah's position. Rebecca Martinez and her associates were being arrested simultaneously at locations throughout the city, their communications having been monitored throughout the operation that had used Sarah as bait to expose their activities. Morrison's salute represented not just recognition of Sarah's past service, but acknowledgement of her continued contribution to federal law enforcement through her willingness to serve as an unwitting asset in the investigation of organized crime, infiltration of legitimate business operations. Her sacrifice of 3 years of civilian normalcy had provided the cover necessary for federal authorities to build cases against criminal organizations that had previously operated beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement methods. The aftermath of Morrison's revelation unfolded in their living room with the surreal quality of a life permanently altered by truth. Sarah felt the weight of 3 years collapsing around her as she processed the magnitude of how thoroughly her civilian existence had been orchestrated by federal authorities. The marriage she thought represented escape from her operational past had actually been another assignment, her emotional investment in building a normal life, nothing more than deep cover for an investigation she hadn't known she was conducting. Marcus stood frozen beside their kitchen island, his face cycling through emotions as he struggled to reconcile the woman he had married with the federal legend Morrison described. His questions came in fragments, each one revealing how completely Sarah had succeeded in hiding her true capabilities from the man who shared her bed. He wanted to know if their entire relationship had been fabricated, if her feelings for him were genuine, or simply another aspect of professional performance. Morrison intervened before Sarah could respond, explaining that federal authorities had identified Marcus as a legitimate civilian with no knowledge of criminal activities within his family's business operations. Her marriage had been authentic, entered into during a genuine attempt to transition away from federal service. The investigation had developed around her civilian life, rather than being planned from the beginning, making her an unknowing asset rather than a deliberately placed operative. But Sarah's anger burned hotter than her relief at Morrison's clarification. She had spent 3 years believing she had successfully escaped the moral complexities of federal law enforcement, only to discover that her handlers had never truly released her from service. The Bureau had used her marriage and family connections as tools for investigating organized crime, without providing her the courtesy of informed consent. Her civilian life had been surveilled and manipulated by the same people she had once trusted with her safety. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Assistant Director Catherine Walsh, whose presence indicated that the evening's events carried implications reaching into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Walsh entered their home with the authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations that required both tactical precision and political sensitivity. Her first priority was ensuring Sarah's physical safety, though her questions revealed concern about psychological impact as well. Walsh explained that the investigation surrounding Meridian Industries had uncovered criminal networks operating within dozens of major corporations, using pharmaceutical and medical supply companies as fronts for money laundering and arms trafficking operations. Sarah's inadvertent access to corporate social circles through her marriage had provided federal authorities with intelligence gathering opportunities that would have been impossible to achieve through traditional surveillance methods. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering, involving corrupt executives, organized crime families, and international terrorist organizations that had been using legitimate business operations to fund illegal activities worldwide. Rebecca Martinez had been a relatively minor player in a network that reached into government agencies, military contractors, and financial institutions across multiple countries. Sarah's presence at corporate social events had provided federal analysts with information that helped map criminal relationships they had been investigating for years. But Walsh's explanation did nothing to diminish Sarah's sense of betrayal by colleagues who had used her personal life as an operational asset without her knowledge or consent. She had believed her federal service was complete when she married Marcus, that her sacrifice of career and identity had earned her the right to build something genuine outside the shadow world of law enforcement. Learning that her handlers had never stopped watching, never stopped using her connections for investigational purposes, felt like a violation that cut deeper than any physical assault. Marcus finally found his voice, demanding to know what role his father had played in the investigation that had compromised their marriage. Walsh's hesitation before responding confirmed his worst suspicions about Richard Blackstone's involvement in events that had destroyed the family gathering that was supposed to celebrate his retirement. The pharmaceutical executive whose legacy was being honored had apparently been cooperating with federal authorities in ways that put his own family at risk. Walsh revealed that Richard Blackstone had contacted federal authorities 18 months earlier when he discovered financial irregularities within Meridian's international operations. His investigation had uncovered evidence suggesting that senior executives were using company resources to facilitate criminal activities, information he had provided to federal authorities rather than attempting to address internally. His cooperation had been voluntary but secret, designed to protect both the company's legitimate operations and his family's safety. The retirement party had been carefully planned as an operational opportunity to force criminal elements within Meridian to reveal themselves through actions against federal assets they believed were vulnerable. Richard's apparent ignorance of Sarah's background had been genuine, though federal authorities had briefed him about the potential for criminal retaliation against family members. His decision to proceed with the investigation despite risks to his loved ones reflected the same moral courage that had built his legitimate business success. But Marcus struggled to understand why his father had chosen to expose their family to criminal retaliation without providing them information necessary to protect themselves. The conversation revealed fractures within the Blackstone family that went beyond the evening's events. Tensions between Richard's sense of civic duty and his responsibilities as a patriarch that had been building for months. Marcus felt betrayed not just by federal authorities who had manipulated his marriage, but by a father who had placed principle above family safety. Sarah found herself defending Richard's decision, even as she grappled with her own sense of betrayal by federal handlers. She understood the moral complexity of law enforcement operations that required civilian cooperation to succeed, the impossible choices between personal loyalty and broader justice that defined careers in federal service. Richard had chosen to risk his family's immediate safety to protect society from criminal organizations whose activities threatened far more people than those gathered at his retirement party. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of federal agents escorting Rebecca Martinez in custody, her presence required for a confrontation that would provide closure to the evening's events. Rebecca entered their home flanked by armed marshals, her earlier corporate confidence replaced by the hollow expression of someone whose carefully constructed criminal identity had been thoroughly exposed. She looked at Sarah with recognition tinged by professional respect for an adversary who had proven more dangerous than anticipated. Rebecca's confession revealed the sophistication of the criminal network that had been operating within legitimate pharmaceutical industry operations for years. Her role had been to identify and neutralize federal agents embedded in corporate environments, using social manipulation and reputation assassination to eliminate threats without attracting law enforcement attention. Sarah had been targeted not because of specific knowledge she possessed, but because her federal background made her a potential threat to criminal operations she might accidentally discover. The methods Rebecca described were elegant in their subtlety, designed to destroy federal assets through social mechanisms rather than physical violence. Mental health accusations were particularly effective because they undermined both personal credibility and professional competence, while appearing to show concern for the target's well-being. Corporate social circles provided perfect environments for these psychological assassinations, offering audiences of influential people who could spread damaging narratives throughout business and political networks. Sarah realized that her public humiliation at the retirement party had been intended as the opening move in a campaign designed to completely discredit her federal service record. If Rebecca's accusations of mental instability had been accepted by the Blackstone family and corporate community, subsequent criminal activity within Meridian's operations would have been protected by the assumption that any warnings from Sarah could be dismissed as paranoid delusions from someone whose psychological competence was questionable. Walsh explained that federal authorities had allowed Rebecca's attack to proceed because stopping it prematurely would have prevented them from gathering evidence about the broader criminal network she represented. Sarah's apparent vulnerability had been necessary to encourage criminal organizations to commit resources and expose operational methods that could be used to prosecute other cases. Her sacrifice of personal dignity had protected other federal agents who might have been targeted by similar reputation assassination campaigns. But Sarah's sense of betrayal extended beyond anger at being used without her consent to deeper questions about the moral framework that justified sacrificing individual agents for broader investigational goals. She had joined federal service believing in clear distinctions between right and wrong, only to discover that effective law enforcement required constant compromise of personal principles for strategic advantage. Her attempt to escape into civilian life had been motivated by exhaustion with ethical ambiguity rather than simple career burnout. Marcus listened to the conversation with growing understanding of the impossible situation his wife had been navigating throughout their marriage. Her mysterious behavior and defensive habits suddenly made sense as the protective mechanisms of someone whose federal service had created permanent enemies among criminal organizations. His anger began shifting from betrayal by her deception to concern for dangers he had never recognized threatening their daily life. The evening concluded with Walsh offering Sarah a choice between returning to active federal service or accepting permanent extraction from any future investigations involving the criminal network she had helped expose. The decision carried implications that reached far beyond career considerations into fundamental questions about identity and purpose that had been driving her internal conflicts since attempting to transition into civilian life. She could reclaim the professional identity that had defined her adult life, or commit completely to building something outside the shadow world of federal law enforcement. Sarah looked around their living room, taking inventory of the life she and Marcus had constructed together over 3 years of marriage. The furniture they had chosen, the photographs documenting their attempts at normal happiness, the accumulated debris of two people trying to build something genuine, despite the secrets that had shaped their foundation. Everything felt simultaneously authentic and artificial, real emotions built on foundations of carefully maintained deception. Her decision would determine not just her professional future, but the fate of a marriage that had survived the revelation of fundamental deception about her identity and background. Marcus waited for her answer with the expression of someone whose life hung in the balance, knowing that her choice would define whether they could rebuild trust from more honest foundations, or whether the evening's revelations had destroyed something that could not be repaired. Marcin stood quietly by their fireplace, his earlier salute having transformed him from corporate security chief into federal guardian, whose job was protecting assets during transition periods. His presence reminded Sarah that even choosing civilian life would not completely free her from the operational world that had shaped her capabilities and created her enemies. Some aspects of federal service left permanent marks that could never be completely erased. The silence stretched as Sarah considered options that would define the remainder of her life, weighing the satisfaction of meaningful federal service against the possibility of genuine civilian happiness, with a man who now understood the full scope of what loving her actually meant. Sarah stepped away from the federal agents gathered in her living room and walked to the window overlooking their backyard, where she had unknowingly practiced combat techniques that Rebecca Martinez had photographed as evidence of mental instability. The irony was not lost on her that maintaining skills designed to protect innocent people had been weaponized against her reputation in corporate social circles. She could see her reflection in the glass, superimposed over the garden, where she and Marcus had spent weekend mornings planning a future that now seemed impossibly naive. The weight of Assistant Director Walsh's offer settled over her like a familiar burden she had thought she had permanently shed. Returning to active federal service would mean abandoning any pretense of normal life, accepting that her marriage to Marcus had been compromised beyond repair by revelations that could never be forgotten. But choosing civilian extraction would mean walking away from capabilities that could protect other agents from the kind of reputation assassination she had survived, leaving colleagues vulnerable to criminal organizations that had proven sophisticated enough to infiltrate corporate America at the highest levels. Marcus appeared beside her at the window, his presence carrying the tentative quality of someone unsure of his reception, after discovering that his spouse was essentially a stranger. His reflection joined hers in the glass. Two people who had shared 3 years of domestic intimacy while never truly knowing each other. When he spoke, his voice carried exhaustion rather than anger, the emotional numbness that followed overwhelming revelation. He asked her directly whether their marriage had ever been real, whether the woman who had shared his bed and built weekend traditions with him had been genuine, or simply another operational identity created by federal training. His question cut to the heart of Sarah's own uncertainty about where her professional performance ended and authentic emotion began. She had entered their relationship believing she was escaping federal service, but now wondered if escape was possible for someone whose identity had been shaped by years of deep cover operations. Sarah turned from the window to face him directly, needing to see his expression as she attempted to explain the complicated relationship between professional deception and personal truth that had defined their marriage. She told him that her love for him had been the most authentic thing in her life for 3 years, even though it had been built on foundations of carefully maintained lies about her background and capabilities. The woman who had married him was real, even if the history she had provided was fabricated. But Marcus struggled to understand how genuine emotion could coexist with systematic deception about fundamental aspects of identity and experience. He had fallen in love with Sarah Chen, pharmaceutical industry wife, not Agent Chen, federal law enforcement legend whose career had included activities he could barely comprehend. The cognitive dissonance between these two versions of the same person created emotional whiplash that left him uncertain which memories from their marriage were trustworthy. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of additional vehicles arriving outside their home, followed by the controlled chaos of federal agents processing a crime scene that extended far beyond their individual situation. Through the window, Sarah could see teams of investigators documenting evidence related to the criminal network that had been operating within Meridian Industries for years. The retirement party that was supposed to celebrate Richard Blackstone's legitimate business success had become the focal point of an operation that would reshape the pharmaceutical industry's relationship with federal law enforcement. Assistant Director Walsh approached them with the patient authority of someone accustomed to managing personal crises that developed during major federal investigations. Her experience handling similar situations was evident in her ability to provide space for emotional processing while maintaining focus on operational necessities. She explained that Sarah's decision about returning to federal service could not be delayed indefinitely, as criminal organizations were already adapting their methods in response to the evening's revelations about federal penetration of corporate environments. The scope of the investigation Walsh described was staggering in its implications for American business and national security. The criminal network that had targeted Sarah represented only one tentacle of an international organization that had been using legitimate corporations as fronts for money laundering, arms trafficking, and terrorist financing operations. Rebecca Martinez's arrest had provided federal authorities with intelligence that would fuel investigations for years, but prosecuting the broader network would require agents with Sarah's unique combination of corporate access and tactical capabilities. Sarah realized that Walsh was not simply offering her a return to federal service, but describing a specialized role that would combine her law enforcement background with the corporate connections she had developed during her marriage to Marcus. The pharmaceutical industry needed federal assets who could operate within executive social circles while maintaining the tactical awareness necessary to identify and neutralize criminal infiltration. Her unwitting service during the Meridian investigation had proven her effectiveness in this hybrid operational environment. But accepting Walsh's offer would mean acknowledging that her attempt to build a civilian life had been fundamentally impossible, that federal agents with her background could never truly escape the operational world that had shaped their capabilities and created their enemies. It would also mean sacrificing her marriage to Marcus, whose cooperation with future investigations would be limited by his lack of security clearance and operational training. Corporate wives had access to social circles that civilian husbands could not penetrate. Marcus listened to Walsh's explanation with growing understanding of the impossible choice his wife faced between personal happiness and professional duty. His questions revealed sophisticated thinking about the moral complexities of federal law enforcement that Sarah had not expected from someone without operational experience. He wanted to understand why federal agencies required agents to sacrifice personal relationships for investigational effectiveness, whether the broader social benefits justified the individual costs imposed on people like Sarah. Walsh's response carried the weight of someone who had spent decades navigating similar moral terrain in her own career. She explained that criminal organizations targeting American business and national security operated without regard for the personal lives of law enforcement agents, making traditional boundaries between professional and private life impossible to maintain. Federal agents who attempted to separate their operational capabilities from their civilian relationships often discovered that enemies did not respect such distinctions. The conversation was interrupted by Morrison's return from coordinating with federal teams processing evidence from the Meridian investigation. His report confirmed that the evening's operation had been even more successful than federal authorities had anticipated, yielding intelligence that would support prosecutions reaching into dozens of major corporations across multiple industries. Sarah's inadvertent service as bait had exposed criminal networks that traditional surveillance methods had been unable to penetrate. Morrison's professional assessment was that Sarah's unique position within corporate social circles made her invaluable for future operations targeting criminal infiltration of legitimate business operations. Her federal background provided tactical capabilities while her marriage to Marcus offered natural cover for accessing executive environments where criminal organizations recruited assets and laundered money. No other federal agent possessed her specific combination of credentials and social access. But Morrison also acknowledged the personal cost such service would impose on both Sarah and Marcus, whose marriage would become a federal asset rather than a private relationship. He had observed other agents attempt to maintain authentic personal lives while serving in similar capacities, and few succeeded in preserving genuine emotional connections under the weight of constant operational requirements. The demands of deep cover work eventually consumed most attempts at civilian normalcy. Sarah felt the familiar weight of federal service pressing against her shoulders. As she considered Morrison's assessment, she had joined law enforcement believing in clear moral distinctions between protecting innocent people and pursuing personal happiness, only to discover that effective service often required sacrificing the latter for the former. Her attempt to escape into civilian life had been motivated by exhaustion with such choices, rather than simple career burnout. Marcus surprised everyone by speaking directly to Walsh about his own role in any future operations involving his wife. He explained that his position within the Blackstone family and pharmaceutical industry provided natural access to corporate environments where criminal organizations might attempt to establish operations. Rather than being a limitation on Sarah's federal service, he wanted to understand whether his cooperation could enhance her effectiveness while preserving some version of their marriage. Walsh studied Marcus with the assessment skills of someone accustomed to evaluating civilian assets for potential operational utility. His corporate background and family connections did provide valuable access to business environments, though his lack of tactical training would limit his direct involvement in dangerous situations. Federal agencies had successfully used civilian spouses as operational assets before, though such arrangements required careful management to prevent exposure that could endanger both partners. The possibility that Marcus might become a federal asset himself, rather than simply an impediment to Sarah's service, opened new possibilities for preserving their marriage while addressing national security requirements. If both partners understood the operational demands and security protocols necessary for effective service, they might be able to build a relationship that served both personal and professional needs. It would not be the civilian normalcy Sarah had originally sought, but it might offer authentic partnership within the context of meaningful work. But such arrangements also carried enormous risks for both partners, as criminal organizations had proven capable of targeting family members to neutralize federal agents. Rebecca Martinez's attack on Sarah had been relatively subtle compared to methods used by international criminal networks that employed kidnapping, torture, and assassination to eliminate threats to their operations. Entering federal service together would make both Sarah and Marcus permanent targets for enemies who respected no boundaries between professional and personal life. Sarah walked through their house one final time, taking inventory of the life she and Marcus had attempted to build together over 3 years of marriage. The accumulated artifacts of domestic happiness surrounded her, from photographs documenting their attempts at normal relationships to furniture they had chosen together during weekend shopping trips. Everything felt simultaneously precious and fragile, authentic emotions that might not survive the transition to operational life. In their bedroom, she opened the closet where her federal service dress uniform hung in protective covering, unworn since her transition to civilian life, but preserved as a reminder of professional identity she had thought she was abandoning. The uniform represented capabilities and commitments that had defined her adult identity, even as she had tried to build something outside the operational world that had shaped her character and created her enemies. Marcus found her there, holding the uniform jacket with its array of commendations and service ribbons that testified to a career most people could never imagine. He touched the fabric gently, as if trying to understand through physical contact the woman who had worn it during operations that had never made the news. His expression showed wonder, rather than fear, as he processed the magnitude of what his wife had accomplished before they met. He told her then that he wanted to understand her world rather than asking her to abandon it completely. His marriage proposal 3 years earlier had been based on incomplete information about who she really was, but now he wanted to make an informed choice about sharing a life with someone whose federal service represented a calling rather than simply a career. If protecting innocent people required sacrificing conventional domestic happiness, he was willing to explore what unconventional happiness might look like. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest as she processed Marcus's words, recognizing the first genuine partnership she had ever been offered in either her professional or personal life. Federal service had always required isolation and deception, while civilian relationships had demanded she hide the capabilities that defined her identity. Marcus was offering something she had never imagined possible: acceptance of both her operational nature and her emotional needs. They returned to the living room together, where Assistant Director Walsh was reviewing operational plans with Morrison, while federal agents processed evidence that would reshape law enforcement's understanding of criminal infiltration in corporate America. The controlled chaos of a major federal investigation surrounded them, but Sarah felt calmer than she had in years as she approached Walsh with her decision. She would return to federal service, but with conditions that reflected the partnership Marcus had offered and the lessons she had learned from 3 years of attempting civilian life. She wanted operational autonomy to develop methods for protecting other agents from reputation assassination campaigns like the one Rebecca Martinez had employed. She also wanted recognition that effective federal service in corporate environments required maintaining authentic personal relationships rather than traditional deep cover isolation. Walsh listened to Sarah's conditions with the expression of someone accustomed to negotiating with valuable assets who understood their own worth. The federal government needed agents with Sarah's unique combination of capabilities and access, making her terms negotiable rather than demands that could be dismissed. The investigation of criminal infiltration in corporate America was expanding rapidly, requiring innovative approaches that combined traditional law enforcement methods with sophisticated understanding of business environments. The agreement they reached would allow Sarah and Marcus to serve together as a federal asset team, using their marriage and corporate connections as cover for investigating criminal organizations that targeted American business operations. It was not the civilian life Sarah had originally sought, but it offered something potentially more valuable: the opportunity to build an authentic partnership with someone who understood both her capabilities and her emotional needs. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a different corporate ballroom, wearing a different, elegant dress while surveying another gathering of pharmaceutical industry executives. But this time she was there as a federal agent rather than a corporate wife, her presence officially sanctioned and her mission clearly defined. Marcus worked the room beside her with natural ease, his corporate background providing perfect cover for their joint surveillance of attendees who might represent criminal interests. The criminal network that had targeted her through Rebecca Martinez had been largely dismantled, its leaders facing federal prosecution, while its methods had been analyzed and countered to protect other agents operating in similar environments. Sarah's experience surviving reputation assassination had contributed to new protocols for safeguarding federal assets embedded in corporate settings, ensuring that other agents would not face the isolation and vulnerability she had endured. Her relationship with Marcus had evolved into something neither of them had imagined when they first married, but it felt more authentic than the careful deception that had characterized their earlier domestic life. They were partners in the truest sense, sharing both operational responsibilities and emotional intimacy in ways that honored both her federal service and their personal connection. It was not conventional happiness, but it was genuine. As the evening progressed, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from public humiliation at Richard Blackstone's retirement party to purposeful partnership in federal service protecting American business from criminal infiltration. The corporate wife, who had been accused of mental instability, had been revealed as one of the most effective federal agents of her generation, her apparent vulnerability actually representing strength that criminal organizations had fatally underestimated. The salute Morrison had delivered that night continued to resonate as recognition not just of her past service, but of her ongoing commitment to protecting innocent people from sophisticated criminal networks that threaten the foundations of American society. She had found her calling not in choosing between federal service and civilian happiness, but in creating space for both, within a life that honored all aspects of her identity. Marcus appeared at her side as the corporate gathering wound down, his presence carrying the comfortable familiarity of genuine partnership rather than the performative intimacy that had characterized their earlier marriage. They left the ballroom together, prepared to return home to a life that was simultaneously operational and authentic, dangerous and fulfilling, professional and personal in ways that conventional relationships could never accommodate. The woman who had once hidden her federal capabilities behind corporate wife performance had learned to integrate all aspects of her identity into service that protected both national security and personal relationships. She was no longer choosing between different versions of herself but living as a complete person whose federal training enhanced rather than threatened her capacity for authentic connection. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.